Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different. So move away from technical, but onto processes. So equally mind-numbing at times. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the HL7 processes that are in place, but also the processes that would be in place for a FHIR IG. So talking about HL7 project scope statements, implementation guide proposals, a publication checklist that we've put in place, and a little bit on using ZULIP and workgroup calls, although there is a part of the conversation a little later is around the community process that we'll go into that more. So just a statement. So many of you will be doing FHIR IGs that are not at all intended to be published or balloted through HL7. So some of these processes won't apply to you. It's also possible as a developer that there would be a project manager or a workgroup co-chair that would be doing some of this work, but we wanted to go through the processes so that you're aware of them, because if you get to the end to go to ballot at HL7 and some of this isn't done, it may be on your task list to get it done. There's been a set of Confluence pages and a checklist developed to help developers go through. So we've talked a lot about the wiki that's there with the information on it. What I've done is extracted some of that information out from the wiki into a set of tables and process, and I'll go through that, and eventually I'll switch over from the PowerPoint and take you out to that Confluence page. So the goal of these pages is to walk through each of the processes and the relevant steps and all of the dependencies so that you know that, if you're going to do a ballot through HL7, we have a process called a notice of intent to ballot. And if you haven't submitted and had your IG proposal approved by the FHIR management group before what we call the NIB, the notice of intent to ballot, has been created, you may not be able to go to ballot. So we've tried to put all of those kinds of dependencies in here. There's also links to the relevant documents and forms that you will need along the way on the Confluence page. So that's the link to the FHIR IG process flow in Confluence. When you get to that page, and I will go out there, this is the first page that you'll get to. There's a process flow. And if you click on the ones on the right-hand side, these boxes on the right-hand side, or actually any of the colored boxes, it will take you to the relevant page. So it goes through the process of deciding you need a FHIR IG with, and I know it's hard to read. So you identify the fact that you need to develop an IG. The first step in HL7 is to create within the workgroup a project scope statement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So then you can go out to that page. Then the question is, gosh, I can't read that, but I can't even read it on my screen, it's so small. Gosh. I guess it says balloting or reballoting the specification. So, and then publishing, which is the next step. There's not a lot I won't go into all things about withdrawal, because most everybody isn't to the stage of withdrawing a specification within FHIR at the moment. But there are processes around there. So many of these processes aren't specific to aren't specific to FHIR, but there are some specific FHIR processes to be aware of. Okay, so there are some calendars that have been set up on the HL7 Confluence page that tell you about dates that you need to be aware of if you're doing any kind of processes of the balloting, publishing within HL7. There is also a set of calendars that you can click on that are FHIR-specific dates. So they include the timelines for IG proposals, when they're due, when the QA period opens, those kinds of things. And I'll open those calendars as well. Okay, so this is just a list of some of the process steps that exist. So a project scope statement gets generated through a HL7 work group. And so there needs to be approval of that project going forward. So the way we work at HL7 is that every activity that you're doing within a work group needs to have a project around it. And it goes through an approval process through the work groups, through the steering divisions, and up through the technical steering committee. So once that project scope statement's in place, work can start. If you plan to ballot, there is a notice of intent to ballot. Oh, sorry.
Where does
Oh, it's on the next health, yeah, talk about it. It's one of the fire-specific ones. But if you are going to have a fire IG, probably should have combined these two together, but that fire IG the IG proposal has to be approved by the fire management group prior to the notice of intent to ballot being submitted. Yes.
You have to have a PSS before you do an IG proposal? You have to have an PSS?
The question is, do you have to have an IG proposal, or PSS before an IG proposal? I would say yes, because there's a bunch of stuff on the IG proposal, like who's the approving work group and things like that. So, yeah.
Basically can't do anything.
And yeah, so the project scope statement number, so an ID has to be assigned to the project scope statement. So, yeah. Okay. There's a process around harmonization, so typically vocabulary harmonization that happens, and so don't know if there's seeing many harmonization proposals from FHIR, but anyway, there may be some coming forward. There is a date around initial content being from a ballot perspective, so initial content has to be delivered.
I thought like the harmonization had absorbed basically all value set creation work. How could FHIR IGs be establishing value sets without doing anything with the harmonization process?
Lloyd's answering. Lloyd's got his hand up.
So in the FHIR design process, there's multiple stages of maturity. When you're just throwing something together, you are free to create your own codes and create your own value sets, and they can contain all sorts of weird and wild things because you're just trying to test and see if the notion actually works. The expectation is that by the time you get to a maturity level 3, you will be leveraging external terminologies wherever possible, and need specific approval to use FHIR-defined terminologies in those situations where you think they're necessary, unless it's a data type of code. So for statuses and things like that, those will always be defined within FHIR and will not go to harmonization ever. But for things like procedure codes and condition codes and all of the things that are typically codable concepts, the expectation is that once you've run it through a couple of connectathons and yeah, this is actually what we need and more or less the kind of stuff that we need there, you are expected to move from FHIR-defined terminologies to external terminologies. Ideally, those are terminologies that are not defined by HL7, but through SNOMED and MOINC and other external organizations. But from FHIR's perspective, going through the HL7 terminology maintenance process, where we put V3 terminology and V2 terminology, is considered to be external from that perspective. So if it's something that HL7 needs to own, you would go through harmonization the same as everybody else. So there's sort of fast track to get up and running and do proof of concept and check that something actually works, but those codes are considered to be temporary and throwaway, and you move to HL7 defined terminology once you are confident that yes, we really do need codes for this and this is what they look like. If you can use externally defined terminology, that is always the preference from the HL7 terminology folks. They would like us to maintain as little as we can because that's not our primary purpose in being. But there are many times where we need codes that nobody else has any interest in maintaining those, and we get stuck doing so.
So all that discussion's kind of off to the side for us here, I think. We've sort of got a standard internal process for managing terminologies for the core specifications that HL7 maintains. But when we start talking about implementation guides and the communities around them, I'm not sure that we've got the right processes for those. Okay, so yes, we would always rather have someone else maintain the terminology. That's a pretty obvious thing to agree, that someone else should do the work. That's pretty straightforward. But you know, if you're a Da Vinci project or you're a US government project or or, you know, an IHE project or whatever, you're going to have this community that says, hey, we need to have a set of codes that captures some concept that we need to exchange for our purposes. It's not HL7's business in the sense that it's core terminology. Nobody else cares about it. So you might well define the value set as part of your, your implementation guide, because you're the community that agreed to these codes in your scope. And we haven't really thought through the procedural ramifications of that. And if you were doing it through a HL7 accelerator project, then we would want to exercise some governance over that, but we haven't really talked about what that would be. But if you're doing it in a related community or an accelerator project, this is all space that we haven't explored really yet.
So I flipped over from the HL7 processes because I think these ones they apply to the FHIR IGs. So as I said, the FHIR IG proposal is due before the NIB is submitted. So if you're going to ballot, you have to submit that NIB, make sure your IG proposal is through FMG and approved by FMG. There is also a date that's called the substantially complete date, and Lloyd's going to help me with this one if I get it wrong, because to me it means something completely different. So substantially complete means that your structure for your IG is in place, and anything that you need in your IG is in place. So there is no tooling requirements at this point in time. Nothing's going to break. They don't have to have anything done. It doesn't mean that the content is there. It just means that your structure around your IG is in place, and that there are no changes to tooling that might be needed to get this published. And Lloyd is nodding, sort of.
That's mostly right.
Okay.
The purpose of the substantively complete deadline is we have had a history of 2 or 3 days before the final content is due for a ballot of people putting stuff into their specification that's new and cool and interesting and totally breaks the publication tools. And then Graham typically has to run around like a mad person trying to fix said tools so that you can actually publish. And he's tired of that. So the expectation is if you're going to do anything new and cool and interesting, it has to be done prior to that substantive freeze deadline, so that if there's going to be tooling issues, we have sufficient lead time to have a hope of actually fixing them. And if you introduce new and cool things after that point and it breaks the tools, our response is going to be, that's really unfortunate for you. We will happily publish your content next cycle.
Next time.
Or perhaps
Later.
don't be quite so new and cool and have content that works.
And this date is roughly around the NIB deadline. So it's fairly early in the process to have this done. There is a FHIR core substantive freeze date. There is a QA deadline that is roughly 2 weeks before the ballot opens. It's probably a little bit more than 2 weeks before the ballot opens, but that's the date that your IG is expected to be complete, ready to go, handed off to the work group, the sponsoring work group, for their approval, because that step has to be done before you can go to ballot. There is a possibility of a shorter QA period of a week if you get the work groups who are the sponsor, the work group who is the sponsor, to formally agree to that. So they have to vote in their work group that they agree to a shorter QA period. But it is the work group, the sponsoring work group, who is responsible for signing off on the QA that you are ready to go to ballot. So that's a 2-week period. So at that point, your IG needs to be handed off to the work group for their approval. There's first and then here. Oops.
So how does that approval need to be documented? We kind of had a situation with ours where they were like, yes, I know we've seen it, we're good, go. But does there need to be a vote recorded?
Yes.
or-
So if they're going to shorten the QA period, they need to vote in their minutes, and that needs to be documented.
Okay, it wasn't a shortened QA period?
Okay,
It
but
was
that
just-
the final
I asked.
approval
Okay.
period or approval of your IG to go forward also needs to be approved into their minutes. Sorry, I saw a question here.
Yes, I've worked a lot. So I want to know what you do for the QA. I mean, it's like a formal, computer system validation. Like, what does that QA mean?
Well, typically from a work group perspective, it's they're agreeing to the content. There is in some projects, like the Da Vinci projects, they do have a formal review process where there are paid reviewers that do the review. And Graham, I think Friday afternoon there's a session on IG review, so there probably will be more documentation on what's expected. But at the moment, there's two pieces. One, the work group signs off on the content, but also there may be a QA person, a QA assigned resource that would do a review. And it's making sure links aren't broken. I do some where I go back through the QA.html. You may be getting emails from me to say, you've got 20 errors that you need to fix, or explain why you're not going to fix them.
Okay.
So, sorry, Linda's got a question. Don't know if I saw enough.
Actually, you can just explain the lead time for PSS, because I think that gets a lot of people.
Yeah, I didn't go into those specific processes. I did have some dates in here and we took them out. So a project scope statement has to be, for the ballot cycle, has to be approved, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's 4 weeks before the work group prior to the ballot cycle. If I got it right. So there's a huge lead time on project scope statements. So for example, if you were wanting to ballot an IG in the January 2020 cycle coming up, you are too late. Your project scope statement needed to be approved by the TSC 4 weeks before now.
That's if it's a new project. If it's a project you're going
Correct.
back to ballot with for an STU or something,
Correct.
you've already got a project scope statement, you're good.
Yes, this is a brand new project. So if you have a brand new IG that's never been balloted, never been a project, and you want to ballot in the January cycle, you have missed that deadline. And we put this in place, sorry. Yeah, but I think that appeal date is gone too. So we have appeal processes. We put this in place from the TSC, similar to Lloyd's comment about the IGs come to be published and the tooling is broken. The TSC got tired of trying to get approvals in and trying to get them all done in advance of ballots, because we were just getting bombarded with project scope statements, a week before the ballot was opening. So
once you have a project scope statement, that's a one-time deal. You don't, when you reballot, that's not something that you need to revisit.
you may have to have another project scope statement depending on how your project was written. Write it broadly, but don't write it that it's going to go on for years and years. I mean, usually a project has a start date and an end date, so your project may be that you're going to go STU through to normative, and then that gives you lots of time. But if you wrote it that you were just going to publish as STU, then you would need a project scope statement to move it to normative or reballot. So.
Yeah, you can. There's a many-to-many relationship between projects and specifications. So it's possible that there are 3 different work groups who are all doing work on a specification. Each of them will need to have a PSS, potentially, that covers the work that they're doing. There'll need to be an IG, and it's also possible that one PSS could result in multiple specifications. So the PSS is really, we are going to do work of some type, and you need to have a PSS whenever you're doing work of any particular type, and obviously producing specifications is one of the types of work that you can do. So that's just so that HL7 can keep track and that we can let the external community know what it is that we're up to. The IG proposal is really about what is the scope of this, what is the metadata associated with this, so we make sure that we don't have overlaps and that we know everything that we need to know in order to actually publish your stuff. And so there's relationships between the two, but they are slightly different things.
Dave, there's 2 questions at the back. I'm not sure who was first, but anyway.
So I was just going to offer a hard example of that. So the Cancer Interoperability Group did a PSS for breast cancer, and now we've done a NIB for radiology on breast cancer, and then we're going to do pathology and then oncology and then surgery. So all of those would fall under one PSS. But each currently needs a NIB at
Correct.
each cycle, and then has to re-go through the IG publication process. But I was just gonna make a comment, it'd be really nice, helpful, if we could merge together those two steps at the point of time when we do a NIB, just merge in the process of an IG proposal. Yep.
Is Lloyd, maybe he's going to answer.
I noticed there's lots of things in the IG proposal that says don't use the same phrase.
Yeah, so
This-
the IG proposal is about this specification should exist. You will likely ballot that specification 7 or 8 times over its lifetime. And the focus of the IG proposal is where is it going to live long term? What is its overall scope boundary? And how does it relate to other things and stuff like that?
So once we've done that once, do we have to redo it each cycle?
No. Once you have permission for an IG to exist, then that IG has permission to exist. You never have to ask again.
2 thumbs up.
Just a general question. How many PSSs are happening at any given time?
Hundreds.
Yeah.
I think there's about, when you assign a new one, we're up to about 1,500. That doesn't mean they're all active, but there are many projects going on at HL7. Not all around FHIR. There's CDA projects. There's still some version 3 projects. There's version 2 projects. There's, other things, so.
358 current fire
Current
projects?
FHIR. Current projects.
Current projects, okay.
Sorry.
Just trying to get a sense of, and do you have a sense of how many of those get sort of close? Is there an end to a PSS?
Yes.
And how many of those close per year, would you say?
Depends on the work group.
Yeah, not enough, that's the short.
The work groups are expected to review their project scope statements on a regular basis. Some work groups do it that I'm involved in and do it every work group meeting. We go through our projects and figure out what we can archive, what we can close. But there is an expectation things do close.
So how does the process change then when, like, we're putting an IG through for its 1.0 version, and then if we need to change it and go through, are there steps that go away from the process?
If you're balloting
The
as a
second
new
round?
version,
Yeah.
you probably don't have to have a new project scope statement, assuming your scope statement was broad enough. You wouldn't have to have a new IG proposal because that was already approved. But the other processes around a NIB, because you're balloting something new, you still have to have that. So many of these processes still exist, but the IG proposal wouldn't and the project scope statement may not if it was broad enough.
I want to know what is a version. So if you're working on an IG and you went to ballot and you had to have changes done, is the next time, is that a version increase or are you still the same version?
We'll cover that a little bit later.
Yeah, stay tuned. Okay. I'm going to move on with some of these. So like I said, there are the QA deadline, and then the final QA deadline is kind of that drop-dead date that you have to have all material off to Lynn, who's at the back, for publication, to be put out in the ballot. And so there is a definite deadline for that each cycle. Sorry. So,
Just one more question about all these, how does the work, across all these PSSs, is there some sort of product management function to prioritize that work? Does that exist?
I think within a work group, there's some prioritization. It depends on how your IG is coming in, for example. So you may have an external project coming in. So I'll take pharmacy, for example, because that's where I spend my time. You may come to pharmacy and say, I have a FHIR IG, and I've got all the people that need. We need you to review the content and go through the processes. And so that's an easier project for a work group to take on because it's the QA, it's the content, that kind of thing. If you came to pharmacy and said, I have an idea for a project, for an IG, we'd like you to take on and do the work, then pharmacy's going to say, we'll prioritize based on all the other stuff we have on. So it really depends on what your IG is and what kind of resources you're bringing to the table. So some of the other ones like Da Vinci, Karen, Jeb,
Alliance.
Karen Alliance, they're coming in with resources and material and to do the work. So.
I mean, part of the PSS process is to let the organization as a whole do that prioritization.
Yeah.
So there are approvals that make sure that all of the different work groups who might care about what you're doing are actually aware of it and have an opportunity to have influence over what you're doing. And the technical steering committee, part of their review process is, so how many projects do you currently have active? How many of those are late or in trouble? And they have the right to say, no, sorry, you can't take on any more until you either close or do something with the ones that you've already got in process. So that's part of what the PSS process is actually about,
Yeah.
is prioritizing and helping to manage workload, and also to ensure that there's visibility into what people are doing.
Okay. And then the last one is around, there's a deadline for proposals for the Connect-a-thon. And I don't know exactly where those are, but they're also listed on the FHIR. So if you're planning to take your material through a Connect-a-thon, there's a proposal date deadline for that.
You might also give people a understanding of for comment versus stew versus informative versus normative, because that's, okay.
I think that's, yeah. There are some appeal deadlines that are put in the process because we know things happen and people miss deadlines. So if you miss a NIB deadline, notice of intent to ballot, there is appeal date. You can go back to the TSC for approval. If you miss the initial content deadline, you also can appeal, and if you miss the final content. So there are some appeal processes put in place if you miss some of these deadlines. Okay, so we've talked a fair amount about the project scope statements, and as Lloyd said, it really is a mechanism for making everybody aware of the activity that's being undertaken by the work groups. There is, I put the link here to the project scope statement, so the form is now, you can create it on Confluence. It used to be a Word document, but we're moving to Confluence. And so there are mechanisms for the work groups to manage that activity. So again, there are links here to the Confluence page. Eventually we're moving to a more automated form through Confluence to help through that workflow, but at the moment it's a form on Confluence.
This is a little gotcha I ran into the other day on this, and to the question about what comes first, the NIB or the PSS. You technically need to get a commitment from your sponsoring work group first, because in order to make this PSS, it needs to land in a space on Confluence. So you need to have that commitment really before you even go about starting to fill out your PSS. Just sort of cart before, it's a chicken or the egg kind of problem.
There are some other, and I've got some other approvals and things around the PSS that have to happen. So it does have to be approved by the sponsoring work group. There are other work groups who may be interested in the work, so there may be some co-sponsoring work groups who also have to approve your project scope statement, and so you may be meeting with multiple work groups to get your project approved. If the project is US realm, meaning that it's a project, a FHIR IG, for example, that is intended to be used in the US, there is a US realm steering committee that has to approve the project. And so that actually has to happen before your work group goes through the approval. So the US realm steering committee has to approve it before it actually hits the work group. If it's a FHIR IG, the FHIR management group has to approve the project scope statement. Again, they're looking to make sure that there's not multiple projects doing the same kind of thing. And depending on the steering division, so you need to get that in place as well, sometimes before it goes to the steering division. You need to make sure your PSS is submitted through to the project management office, and so that gives it its ID, and it's kind of the starting point. Once it's submitted to the PMO, it actually, you've met some of the requirements for the deadline of having your PSS submitted, 4 weeks before the working group meeting to be balloted in the next cycle. So don't forget.
How does it work with the, how does it work with the Confluence one then? Does it just automatically does this all happen automatically now?
I don't think that automation is actually in place. I believe you have to forward that link to the project management office. At some point in time, when we move to that automated tool, it will actually fire off emails to the relevant people to go through the approval. But there is no workflow on the project scope statement at the moment.
Forward links. But the work group still comes first, even before US realm. Even if not the other way around. You said it in the order that I wrote down US Realm has to come first, but it says work groups first, then US Realm.
Yeah, but sometimes the US realm will have some influence on what work groups it goes to. So if you're not, for example, if you're not sure what work groups to go to, then hit US realm first and they may give you some ideas. But US realm definitely.
PSS under US Realm. I mean, you have to write your PSS in order for people to know what you're asking about. So where do I set it up on Confluence?
Right.
You know, like I'm just hedging my bets, and I'm like, I think patient
Well, it can be
care is gonna
moved. If
be
you
where
set it up,
lands.
say you thought it was a pharmacy project, you set it up under pharmacy, you can always move it to another Confluence space
Okay.
if it gets transferred to another work group. Okay, I'm supposed to be going. Okay, so there's approvals through steering division, and then the technical steering committee. Those are handled, once you've gone through steering division, the steering division co-chairs manage the approvals through the TSC unless there's some questions around it. So, talked about that date. Okay, the IG proposal, there is a template on the wiki, the link is there. I don't think that's moved to Confluence yet, Lloyd. And that has to be submitted to the FMG, Fire Management Group, at least 3 weeks prior to the NIB, and it has to be approved by the NIB deadline. Okay.
Not yet, I'll wait.
Okay. Notice of intent to ballot is submitted by the work group co-chair, so that if you've got something going to ballot, you need to make sure that co-chair has submitted the NIB, and the links are here. Prior to going to ballot, your fire IG has to be at a fire maturity level of 2 if you're balloting at STU.
So
This is a new requirement. Yep.
so FMM level 2.
Will be discussed later.
Okay, but basically it's saying that you have to take your IG to a connect-a-thon before you can ballot.
Correct.
Before you can even submit the NIB, before you can even submit a NIB, so you can do the project scope statement, get approval, take it to a connect-a-thon, and then submit your NIB.
Correct. Okay. Or it has to be a maturity level of 5 if you're going normative. Okay. That is a new requirement that just came in.
That's now. And it's not just, you have to have 3 organizations testing it at the connect-a-thon, is that correct?
You need to have 3 independently developed systems from different organizations. And it doesn't need to be at an HL7 Connect-a-thon here.
Right.
You can hold a virtual Connect-a-thon so long as it's open to the public. Anybody who wants to participate can. That still counts. The intention is that we try to avoid taking things to ballot that have never actually been implemented in code. We want to make sure that it actually works for real before we have the ballot community review it.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So, as a project manager, I'm just going to dial this one back a little bit. So, from a level setting of expectations, generally good idea before you even submit your project scope statement to have had this tested or piloted or connect-a-thon, because timeline-wise, I can submit a project scope statement, 4 weeks later submit my NIB. Now, that's what I'm saying. You guys have changed this process. So realistically speaking, if I submit a project scope statement, if I haven't gone to a connect-a-thon or tested, I may have to sit out around.
So, so the PSS, as soon as you have an inkling that we're going to do work in this space, you should be starting your PSS.
Right.
PSS should be at least 6 months before you're planning to ballot. PSS is you're going to do work.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
that's intentional. We
Yeah.
do not want people showing up with content and saying, we'd like to go to ballot next month.
if you do that, it puts other things in place. So if you come in with IG that's completely developed externally, there's another step that the Architecture Review Board has to review your content. So there are some processes in here that,
Well, we just need to take this back to O&C, and so I need
So-
to take it back to O&C and say, okay, this is what the level of expectation is going to be moving forward, because it's changing for them.
So, I mean, I don't think we really get too hung up on this. The way our community is built is really following Tuchman's stages of development, and what we're trying to do is you've got to You've got to have a project statement, so we've agreed that we're going to do it. You go ahead and do all the way through to norming before you come to HL7, and then you find out HL7 for some reason or other can't take the work as it is or in the scope. That's probably not a very good idea. Right, but then HL7 says before you can start thinking about something, you have to have a project scope statement. So before you're even storming or forming, well, that's probably not a very good idea either. So you're just trying to, align different processes. It's nothing special about this. So what we're saying is, we've had some projects come where they've suddenly had this really great idea and gone, we're going to go to ballot. And they haven't let Tookman stages happen, right? And that's what we're pushing back against, right? Where you just helpfully they're going to go to ballot. And so we don't want to have that. We want to have some, community building, some actual testing so that the community building is not just a fantasy, it's something real. And if we see genuine efforts for building community, then we're going to be good with that. Whatever the sequence. We do have mandatory, if you develop content outside HL7, and then you bring it to HL7, you've got a higher bar to climb because we've got to show that transparency had been practiced. So that's the kind of the downside of doing stuff outside HL7, but all we're looking for is a genuine, honest community building attempt. And the process is trying to push you to being honest about that, but the process isn't a hammer to break projects on. That make sense?
No, I just think the pushback's going to come. We have a chicken egg problem where we can't get pilots. We can't get people to show up to a connect-a-thon until we have an IG for them to actually test. Because they'll say to us, hey, we have no funding, we have no resources, ONC's not paying for this. You want us to show up for a connect-a-thon, you need an IG because we're not going to put resources into something that could be vaporware or a proof of concept.
So you can have an IG.
You can have an IG.
Whether it's balloted or not, that's a tricky question because there's parts of the community that go, hey, it's not balloted, it's not real. But our biggest rate limitation is ballot, right? We just don't have the energy to do that. And then we have ballot people going, hey, it's not tested, it's fantasy, right? It's vaporware because it hasn't gone through the other processes. And so then that's not so much a chicken and egg, it's just, different communities trying to externalise work to each other. And so that becomes in the end a political question. And so I expect that tension will continue to play out. And we have balloted things that haven't gone through that, but we're trying to say that you can't, because the other thing that we know is once you ballot something, it sort of takes on a life of its own because it's balloted, and you've taken something that's someone's fantasy in their head to ballot. And it's
Some
like
people have
balloted.
very strange fantasies.
It's balloted.
Therefore.
You see what I'm getting at? So to the communities who say it's vaporware until it's been balloted, the cost of that can be that we've done this a lot in our history, where we've taken stuff that seemed like a really good idea to genuinely well-informed people, and it turned out it wasn't. And any number of us in the room have done that. That's why we're trying to say make it real before you ballot, because otherwise you'll front run your own, ability to build a community. But
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there, Greg.
Yeah, sorry, I've gone to the next slide. There is one step that I missed. If you had previously balloted something and you want to reballot it, you need to have completed your ballot reconciliation and posted the ballot reconciliation spreadsheet prior to going to ballot the next time around. So that is a step that has to be done. Okay. Sorry.
I find there's a real problem with people who take work to ballot, and you get all this community feedback, and the community is counting on that work finishing. And there's no teeth right now around a timeline or a commitment that if you take a piece of work to ballot and the community coughs up feedback and input, that there's a responsibility to reconcile those comments into your ballot within some period of time and publish the fixed piece of work. I think that's a amiss for us not to have one of these due dates
Yep,
along
I
with the
agree.
process, because a lot of energy gets wasted.
There are some, so work groups have to have, there are work group health measures, and so things like idle ballots and some of that get played into work group health, but I do think so, and I will take that back to the TSC, because I think that that's important. Okay, I've talked about these QA deadlines. I'm not going to go through them again. I think I've walked through most of it. I've walked through this. There is a Confluence page on the QA criteria. Has been created a readiness checklist, or a checklist that has to be created around. So this is kind of what it looks like, and you can go out to the Confluence page and look at it. So there's a Confluence page that you have to fill in if you're going to go to ballot. So there's a bunch of places to fill in information like the name of the IG and the project scope statement and what kind of ballot. This has to be submitted, completed and submitted. It goes to Lynn, Graham, and myself. And it has to be done before the ballot opens. So there are some things you can't actually do too far ahead of that, but we need to receive this checklist. And really the checklist is reminders to you about what has to be in place. And so it's not just going through and checking this all off, because it will ask for things like the URI, or the URL of the continuous build for your IG. It will ask to you to confirm that you've got the headers and footers in place. And so many of the things that are part of the quality criteria, you're asked to check off that you've done that. So it isn't going through and just ticking this off because it has to be submitted, because you may get emails after the fact from Lynn and others saying, but your footer's wrong, but your version's wrong, you need to fix this. And there will come a time where if this is still wrong leading up to ballot, you will not be able to go to ballot. So this checklist is in place as a reminder to you that all of this is in place. One of the things that's in the checklist is your QA.html clear of all errors or warnings? And you can say no, but you better say no that it's because Graham has agreed some of them are tooling issues.
Or FMG's agreed they're okay.
Or FMG has agreed that they're okay, right. So these are some of the common issues. The correct new HL7 logo, the publisher, if it's an HL7 one, with the workgroup full name and contact, the history page listing all other releases, any realm issues, version issues, header and footer information, the publish box, the downloadable zip file is there if you're missing it.
Do you have to do this before workgroup QA? Is this something that the author does before workgroup QA, or is this done in conjunction with workgroup?
Well, I would say ideally if you're saying to the work group that your IG is ready to go, this should be done. But I'm not sure in reality that that's always the case. But I would say if you're saying you're done and ready for the work group to sign off, this should all be done.
Probably easy for you to answer, but I didn't notice the logo for HL7 change. What's the difference?
See this logo down here?
Yeah.
That's the new logo.
What did it look like before? I mean, it looks like that.
Busier.
It was lovely, and from the 80s, it was just beautiful.
Yeah. It's cleaner. That's okay. So there is some monitoring going on. So the status of your IGs during the current cycle are monitored by me at the moment. If you're developing an IG that is intended to go to ballot, you will get emails from me asking for information along the way. Typically, those emails come out at the start of the NIB deadline, so asking for things like your URL for the CI build for your IG, making sure we've got the right contact people, because if there's problems along the way. And really what we want to do is support the developers of IGs in meeting the requirements and meeting the deadlines. And from an FMG perspective, that information is sent to them so that they can make sure they're monitoring some of the QA of the IGs. We'll talk about this more. So we've talked a little bit about some of them.
I'll talk about that in the next section. Same as this.
Let's talk about this as well. This is the Q calls, and I think that's it.